So we're going to go into 2020 for a little bit here. Corporate media bias on 2020 Democratic race already in high gear. Let's be clear, one reason mainstream journalists were so wrong about the 2016 election is because they are largely divorced from poor and working class voters. After having been a mainstream TV news pundit, this is from the article written by Jeff Cohen, I am unfortunately addicted to cable news. That is rather unfortunate, Jeff. And all the blather and repetition laughably overhyped as breaking news, even when it's the same news that's been breaking and breaking and breaking for hours or days. Or in some cases, years. I would add to this. In some cases, years. But I'm more bothered by the repetition of pundits and the narrowness of discussion, resulting in a number of unexamined cliches. Although the Democratic race for president has barely launched, mainstream media bias is already in orbit. As everyone in politics knows, and mainstream pundits acknowledge, the Democratic Party is seriously divided in two. On one side is the party establishment, allied with corporate donors, preaching pragmatism, caution, and incrementalism. There's nothing pragmatic about an incremental solution for a catastrophic problem. Again, there's nothing pragmatic about an incremental solution for a catastrophic problem. So they're preaching falsities. They're preaching stuff that won't work because it has been proven not to work. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is literally insanity. That's what that is. It is insanity. So on one side, you have the people just trying to please the donors because they really have no policy ideas. They have no actual policy perspectives. They just want to please the donors, or they're misguided into thinking that's not what they're doing. On the other side is much of the party's activist base. You don't even need the word activist in there. On the other side is much of the party's base. You know why? Because over 80% of people that identify as Democrats are for progressive policies. Animated by issues and allied with elected officials like Bernie Sanders and a young crop of insurgent Congress members calling for transformative change to protect the planet and people from corporatism and greed. Strange thing, only the corporate Democratic side is regularly represented on MSNBC and CNN. It's not really a strange thing, it's by design, as this article points out. Actually, it's not so strange given the powerful economic forces that own and sponsor mainstream news, Comcast, Time Warner, Jeff Bezos, etc. So, you know, I'm not trying to like overly nitpick the article here. I'm really not. But you guys know me. I don't like calling it mainstream media or mainstream news because there's nothing mainstream about it. It represents the elite view of the 1%. There's nothing mainstream about that. Mainstream news is independent media. That's what should technically be called mainstream news. Independent media. Journalists on the ground telling you a story about something. They're right there and they're saying, this is what's happening. I'm seeing it with my own eyes. I'm filming it with my camera. You decide. That's mainstream news. That's what should be considered mainstream news. And I know it's just a matter of verbiage. I'm not trying to overly nitpick the article. I'm just trying to... We should call that stuff corporate news because that's definitionally what it is. It's corporate media. It's owned by a small elite group of corporations that have no business being in news. Jeff Bezos has no business being in news. Jeff Zucker, no business being in news. Comcast, no business being in news. It's the equivalent as if McDonald's would get into the news business. We went over that analogy. It's the same thing. It's like if McDonald's got into the news business and all of a sudden you see an article that says eating a Big Mac 3 times a day makes your penis bigger or gives you instant abs. Oh, this is science. I'm sure there's no red flags here. It is the exact same thing. In the United States, the people that control news and information have no business being in news and information. They do have conflicts of interest. That is textbook fascism. Our media structure cannot be saved, and it is not worth saving. It is toxic. So, getting back to this article, the now daily MSNBC and CNN discussions of the Democratic 2020 race, which usually include mainstream print reporters and Democratic operatives singing the same tune, feature a chorus of corporate Democratic talking points, like standards to go moderate. All right, so now they talk about 2016. I have no interest in revisiting any of that. So let's get back to the thesis here. Let's be clear. One reason mainstream journalists, again, we'll substitute. One reason corporate journalists were so wrong about the 2016 election is because they are largely divorced from poor and working class voters of all races. Very true. On last Friday's Meet the Press, MSNBC host Chuck Todd, the actor who poses as a newsman. Chuck Todd is a mediocre actor who is playing a role as a newsman. Chuck Todd knows nothing about news. Chuck Todd is completely clueless. He's not even convinced on climate change until recently when he had to change his tune. He brought on Marcos Molotsas of the Daily Kos, and they're poo-pooing Bernie. I heard about that video. All right. So, good article by Jeff Cohen. Again, I wasn't trying to like overly nitpick it, just, making a few observations. And that's something we already know. You get the corporate Democratic view from the corporate media. They try to make it out like those corporate Democrats are the only one that have a chance at winning, and you have to unite and get behind them and shut up because Trump. That's what they want. It's their way at maintaining the status quo. Because really, it's just continuing the money party. That's what it's doing. And we all know what's going to happen in 2020. They're going to try to shove Kamala down our throats. They're going to try to shove Biden down our throats. They're going to try to shove this corporate-approved candidate down our throats who's not going to do Medicare for all, who's not going to address climate change, who's not going to address living wages, who's not going to address fracking, who's not going to... You get the idea. The status quo benefits the corporate elites, and the corporate media is part of the corporate elite, so they try to subtly uphold the status quo. And they try not to make that too obvious by continuing their horse race coverage of Republican versus Democrat, which is corporatist versus corporatist. And again, this is why our media structure, it cannot be saved, and it should not be. It is absolutely toxic. It is absolutely toxic to the idea of the democracy. Of a democracy. And why do we criticize them? Because they have the power. They have the power. It should be a headline every day that our media is owned by an elite group of corporations that have no business being in news. So there you go. And you're seeing that reflected in the 2020 coverage, just like it was reflected in the 2016 coverage, and the 2012 coverage, and the 2008 coverage. 2008 was the first primary I really followed. I was a Dennis Kucinich guy. Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul were the only two candidates that were actually truly anti-war. MSNBC, who at the time was owned by General Electric, got them off the debate stage as soon as they could by altering the rules so that they couldn't debate. Because they didn't want an anti-war candidate up there. All right.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your news on with Ron.